Hi everyone, welcome to Jewflix episode 2. We're here today with Emile Ackerman, who is a rabbinical student in New York, and who founded IECA, which is a French Jewish structure helping to promote Jewish diversity and Jewish studies in France. He's going to speak to us about the very different Jewish denominations that exist today all over the world, and from history to reality today. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat or in the Zoom link directly to me. We will have a moment for the questions at the end. And you can always also tweet them at WUJS at Jewish Students, #Jewflix. Yeah, welcome, Emile. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. Hi, good morning or good afternoon to you all. I'm delighted to participate in the WUJS seminar. I think it's a real necessity to organize this and to offer Torah courses or like to teach classes despite the current events. So thank you for the introduction, Jonathan. I will reintroduce myself quickly. So I'm originally from France, and I'm currently studying in an Orthodox rabbinical school in New York, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. And I want to talk with you today about the diversity of the Jewish people. We are kind of lucky in our misfortune today because there's never been so much Torah. When I open my Facebook feed, my Twitter feed, and even the Instagram, I see Torah everywhere, and which is not only the prerogative of the ultra-Orthodox, but which emanate from like all the different denominations, all different like streams of Judaism, and I think that's awesome. And so why is there like all of those denominations? Why does Jewish people have all of these divisions and subdivisions? Of course, because we only have like 30 minutes. My goal is to provide some historical and philosophical understanding and context so that we can, at the end, maybe better understand each other. Let us begin with a brief historical reminder of the development of the Jewish people. Contrary to popular belief, there have always been multiple streams or Jewish sects that got along more or less well and often less well. So you know the biblical story first, the patriarchs, then Egypt, slavery out of Egypt, Persia is coming next. So you better, learn that again. Then the conquest of the land of Canaan, the construction of the first temple and its destruction, which results in what is called the first exile. And after the first exile, there's already kind of a schism between the Samaritans, who are less than 1,000 today, and not really considered as Jews, but of whom we say that they converted out of fear. The Samaritans did not recognize the validity of the word of the sages, what is called the oral Torah. For in mainstream Judaism today, we accept the fact that there is the written Torah, the Hebrew Bible, and its interpretation that comes with it, the oral Torah. It's called oral Torah, although today it's also completely written because it comes from like an oral transmission that never ceases to develop, therefore it is oral and alive, kind of. So we have first the Samaritans after the first exile. There were people living in the land of Canaan and around, and so they kind of converted, but not really recognized as Jews even today by the state of Israel. It's a complicated situation. And then at the time of the second temple, things get a lot more complicated. We have the Zealots, who are kind of like warrior Jews calling to rebel against the non-Jewish powers in place. Also, the first Christians were originally practicing Jews who believe in the divinity of Jesus. So normal Jews, like, practicing Torah and Mitzvot, but just like believers in the divinity of Jesus. And then the schism with like the Christianity happened way after. And also another one that is not very well known in Elephantine, an Egyptian island, an active Jewish community that even had its own temple, and with which the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah even attempted a reconciliation, but we really don't know anything today about them. And like in Jewish day school, you don't learn about this community, but it's a very interesting part of the Jewish history that I encourage you to look after that. And so we see therefore that already in ancient times, there were many ways of living Judaism, and some ways have endured until today and others have been forgotten. And today, all of the denominations, all of the Judaism that we know, all its denominations are kind of heirs of the Pharisee Judaism. That is the denomination that gave us the Mishnah, the Talmud. All the names of known rabbis that you know are part of the Pharisee stream and their heirs. The Pharisees are the rabbis who composed the Mishnah, the Talmud, and finally created the Judaism that we know today. Without them, they probably won't have much left today, because after the destruction of the temple, it is the Pharisees who completely adapted Judaism from a Judaism of worship in the temple with sacrifices. Then after the destruction, they had to adapt it. And so they went from this Judaism of worship to a Judaism of study, texts, and rituals, like daily rituals for everyone. Because before that, when you were like an everyday Jew, normal Jew, you went to the temple like sometimes during the year, but otherwise, like there were, except from like some rituals that you had to do about like your daily work in your field, you weren't like reconnected as today. And the fact that we do prayers today instead of sacrifices, for example, is an adaptation of the rabbis from the Mishnah, the Talmud. And really everything, the Seder of Pesach, everything that we do today comes from the Pharisees. So it's we have a lot to thank them for. And so yeah, so that's why also today, in order to understand Judaism, to understand really what is it about, you need to really take a look in depth at the Jewish text, because that's where everybody comes from. Everything comes from every mitzvah, if you want to put like some meaning into the text, into your daily life as a Jew, you need to take a look at the text. And that's why today, if you take just the Bible, you won't be able to understand a lot that's going on in your daily life as a Jew in the synagogue, because it comes like originally from here, but all the adaptation, all of the rituals that we have come really from the Mishnah and the Talmud, and thanks to the Pharisees. And it's from all of those interpretations of this text that the various modern streams of Judaism will be born. But we go back to that. And then after the second exile, so the destruction of the second temple, the Jews spread to the four corners of the world, but are often subjected to policies of discrimination, despite some periods of calm according to places and times. They lived in ghetto or closed communities, although again, it was more or less possible to be open to the outside world. It really depends. And due to the sometimes very difficult periods, messianic hope rises and created like fake messiahs, such as Shabtai Tzvi and Jacob Frank, people were disillusioned after the failure of those people, no longer know where to turn. And so it was at this time in the 18th century that from the Baal Shem Tov, for example, Hasidism was born, which still exists today. And initially, it was a sect that the majority of Jews rejected because they were not very, welcoming of new ideas, especially after the fake messiahs. And Hasidism was organized around the Rebbe, of which it was said sometimes that we could do miracle. They rejected the form of traditional study and so even some minor halachot. But today, although Hasidism persists, the differences are minimal, and they are theologically close to the rest of the Orthodox world. I think you probably know the Chabad, who are a branch organizer around the Rebbe of Lubavitch, today very active and accepted by all different streams of Orthodoxy. So that was kind of the first modern schism. They were very proactive opponents to Hasidism, which are called the Misnaged. They were the very traditional thinking Jewish stream, and there was kind of almost a big spiritual war going on. They were excommunicating each other, not talking to each other, but kind of thanks to the Enlightenment and the new challenges, I think it was a good way to reunite those two streams against kind of a common enemy, because after that comes the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, the l'âge des Lumières in French, with a big religious, intellectual, philosophical emancipation. And for the first time, Jews are completely out of the ghetto, and they are recognized as full-fledged citizens. The Jews who live their religion only in community are facing new challenges. Should we remain Jewish? Should we take part in the religious, intellectual, philosophical emancipation of our time? It was kind of a big first new challenge for the Jews at this time, because before were either a religious Jew or not a Jew at all. We lived in close community, but when the doors opened, everything became different. It all started in Germany. Synagogue begin to modify more or less radically the prayers and the cults. For example, the references to the sacrifices, which were deemed too barbaric, were removed, and the request for vengeance from God against all the peoples who have mistreated us also gone. The references to the return of Zion, to Israel, also gone, because if we are full-fledged citizen of the country of Germany, for example, then why speak of another another country, another dream country? We don't want to go back to Zion. Then we just want to stay German, and Germany is our real country that we have a special place for in our heart. And this may be a surprise also, but while today most Jewish communities are Zionists, with the exception of one branch of Orthodoxy, the first Reform Jews were very much against it for this reason, because that the Jews have been often attacked as on the charge of double allegiance, and they didn't want that, so they said that they were going to just remove everything. They will not talk about Israel, but the fact that they go back to Israel is just an idea, a special idea, a concept, but it's not something that we really want to go back to, because our country is Germany. And similarly, sermons are then given in the vernacular, in the language of the country, which was not necessarily the case before. Even more, some even remove references to the Messiah, saying that we do not believe in the coming of a person, but rather of an era, Like we don't believe anymore in the Messiah as someone, but like it's more of an idea. It's more of the idea of the humanity progressing to like advancing towards like a more beautiful age with no wars, where everything would strive for intellectual perfection and everything. It was like the wine, it was the in the spirit of the time. Very optimistic, tolerance, philosophy, openness. It kind of smelled like the Messianic era. But of course, the Jews quickly lost their hope when Nazis and the unthinkable came to power. But at the time, it was very, very you could afford this kind of optimistic view. So this is like kind of the birth of the reform movement. All of these problems like emanated from the Wissenschaft of Judentum, the critical school of the sciences of Judaism. They begin to question certain dogmas about like the authority of the Bible and its author or authors, and thus to contextualize the commandments that became obsolete for some. So it's the objection like of biblical criticism today that the majority of Orthodox still fight, meaning if the Bible is a composite product of its time, why should we follow its commandments, its laws? If it was given by some king at one time, and it was not really Moses who wrote the Bible, then maybe everything then is false, or we need to take some of the key concepts, but we don't need to really follow the mitzvah, the commandments. One of the great figures of this movement, Abraham Geiger, is known for having said to an assembly of rabbis that the Talmud must go, meaning like the authority of the Bible, the authority of the Pharisees must go. We don't like. It was a very radical figure, but to him, it seemed that like we needed to take the key components, the key concepts of the Bible, which is like ethical monotheism, which is like the strive for human perfection, but really we don't need anymore all of those like weird laws like kashrus, what to eat, what not to eat. It was very very radical about these things. And also he refused the very idea of a Jewish people that kind of transcended borders. For his only people were the people of this country, and he did not feel so bad as people like to the other, like as a people to the other Jews of the world. Is famous for having said that the fate of the Jews in other country doesn't really, impact us, German Jews, meaning. And even further, some reform members abolished circumcision and even the prohibition of mixed marriages, meaning to marry non-Jews. And all of this happened in the 1800s during the Reform Congresses. A lot of different Reform Congresses, which gave rise to the Reform movement as we know today. And during one of those Congresses, Rabbi Zechariah Frankel, who was a Reform also member, Reform rabbi, decided to secede, to go on its own way because of like a motion to abandon Hebrew in prayer and to suppress the idea of a human Messiah. It was too much for Rabbi Zechariah Frankel, who also had certain ideas, like a philosophy. And according to his vision, it was good to advance Judaism and to adapt it somehow to modern times, but while keeping a more traditional vision and keeping the halacha in place. And so he was the father of the conservative movement of Masorti. So in order to say again what I'd said like quickly, first, well, all the Jews, no movement, no name, except that they are like maybe the heirs of the Pharisees. And then with the Enlightenment, the Reform movement is born, and they made great changes in liturgy and theology, very radical changes in the beginning. And then the conservative movement with Zechariah Frankel, which seeks to maintain a more moderate but modern voice. So for the Reform movement, there is no halacha anymore, meaning you don't have a law that really obligates you in some like rituals. You don't need to do that. If you want to, you can, but it's not mandatory. There is no like God which is asking of you to do like these weird things of wrapping tefillin on your arm or to eat that and not that. It's like it's not the idea anymore. The idea is that Judaism is there to bring ethical monotheism to the world, and that's kind of it. You will see later that the reform movement has changed and is not about that anymore. But at the beginning, it was this idea, and opposing, and so the conservative movement is kind of like the middle path at this moment, is saying we need to take into account like modernity and all of its challenges, but halacha still exists, and we need to adapt it, we need to change it, but there is still this idea of something mandatory. But it's not about like God really asking of you something. The conservative movement is more about like this idea that even though God is not like asking you directly, maybe the mitzvah, the commandments have something to teach you and something to teach humanity. That's why they are still mandatory, even though we can still adapt a lot of the halachot, a lot of the law. So that's the conservative movement, the Masorti movement in its beginning. And opposing it, the Orthodox movement is then born, because we often have the idea that first there was the Orthodox movement and then the Reform movement came and tried to change everything. But that's kind of false, because Judaism was before very localized, with each rabbi managing the affairs of the business of his community, and there was like a certain acceptable plurality. But with the Reform movement, the strictest ones organized in return to counter the influence of the Reform movement. So that's when actually the Orthodox movement is born. There was first the Reform movement, then the conservative movement, and then at the end the Orthodox movement was born. Because again, before, like, you were Jew, and when you were a Jew, you were a religious Jew following your rabbi and doing everything. Then the challenge of the Enlightenment, the new stream of Judaism, the Reform, then the conservative movement, they were opposed to this kind of way of life, but this way of life was not called orthodoxy. It was just called like the traditional way of Jewish life. And so that's why after the Reform movement, the more like the rigid part of the rabbis and the more rigid part of the traditional way of life, they tried to organize, and they gave birth to the Orthodox movement. Some were in favor of some modern ideas, some aspects of modernity, while stressing always that the most important thing was always to put the Torah first, the Torah above everything in the hierarchical level. So that was like a current of orthodoxy that is called neo-orthodoxy. One of the main figures, which is the Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, Samson Raphael Hirsch. Others stricter will become the Orthodox movement that we know today, and its strict branch also today, the Haredim. But today, the currents, the streams have kind of evolved and changed. The Reform movement has won the majority of Jews, and its philosophy is somehow less radical than in its beginning. Because they have they are not anti-Zionist anymore, and they also came back on their most like radical reforms. So today the movement of the Reform movement is very, very Zionist, very involved in Israeli politics even, even it's a little bit to the left, of course, but it's very, very involved, very Zionist, very supportive of the establishment of a Zionist state, of a Jewish state. And also the idea that the commandments are not mandatory state, but there was like a big return to this voluntary commitment to some of the commandments. They are not, so they are not as radical as what they were before. But still, there is no halacha in itself that is mandatory to us. But everything is, you can just like try to see what the halacha is saying. If something talks to you, speaks to you, then you can do it, and it's very helpful. That's like kind of the idea of the reform movement. Everyone can take some of like the concepts, the meaning from the tradition that suits him, and there are no good or bad Jews. And also it goes without saying that they are completely egalitarian, that there's no difference between Jews and between men and women. Some of streams they don't make any difference between Kohanim, Leviim, and Israeli, meaning like the hierarchy that's still in place today in the Orthodox and some of places in the conservative movement. The conservative movement, the Masorti, are kind of like in trouble today. Because while 50 years ago they were the strongest movement among young people in the US, today their impact has slowed down a lot. Moreover, while they were initially very similar to the most liberal Orthodox, so to the right, to the left wing of Orthodoxy, but to the right on the spectrum, today they are sliding much more towards the left, closer to the reform movement. Their philosophy is that still that theoretically the law is mandatory, that every Jew must respect the halacha. But it is appropriate for each person to study the text deeply in order to make his choices responsibly. And the problem today is that since most people are not very involved in studying of text and daily Torah, there is often like kind of like a big gap between the conservative rabbis, which are like very, very firm, very practicing rabbis, and the lay people, the normal people in the conservative community who are in the majority not as involved in Jewish study, in Jewish texts, in Jewish life as their rabbis or the Orthodox counterparts, which was not the case 50 years ago or 30 years ago when the conservative was like a big movement and a lot of traditional conservatives still were the majority. Today, it's not the case. There are still a lot of different, everything is on the spectrum. So there are still a lot of different Jewish communities. There are more left, more right-wing, conservative on the spectrum of halacha. But that's like the general, direction. And the Orthodox also today are very divided. There's like a very right-wing branch strict, which runs like a very close Judaism community and rejects what could be called the modern world. And then more moderate whole spectrum that more or less accept to work, to associate and talk with non-Jews, to read non-Jewish philosophy, and to accept contributions from the outside world. And further to the left, the modern orthodoxy, which is like a stream in orthodoxy, on the spectrum of orthodoxy to the left, he narrated the neo-orthodoxy of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, mentioned earlier, and one of the modern pioneers of this stream is Rav Soloveitchik. Again, it's on the spectrum, but the idea is that they accept that the modern world has something to offer Judaism, the modern world has something to give, and they also more or less accept certain insights from critical history and changes in the law, in the halacha, on sensitive subjects such as the place of women in tradition. Because while the conservative and reform movements are completely egalitarian, the Orthodox movement is still grasping with these issues. And so today, with the exception of one branch of modern Orthodoxy, the Orthodox movement refuses to dialogue or to recognize validity to the non-Orthodox movements. Because indeed, if one is of the opinion that there is only one Torah, immutable, and one has the truth, holds the truth, then why should it recognize the other movements? Even the rabbi of Lubavitch, the Chabad movement, he issued a letter saying that these movements were doomed to disappear. So even though the currents of Hasidism are very open-minded, still on the theological level, there is only place for orthodoxy. But today, it's my opinion that we need to recognize that everyone who is Jewish today that practices is Judaism does so by choice. It's not like before where you were in the ghetto and you were either Jewish or completely shunned out of your community. And whether it's like whatever way is living as Judaism, whatever denomination, it's always something very active. It's always something like, it's always some way of trying to, get meaning out of the Jewish tradition. And so that's why on the Orthodox level, the Orthodox mindset, several halachic legal paths are possible, maybe to allow a certain dialogue or even recognition of other movements. And I think they may be needed today. And so, for example, Rabbi Soloveitchik first allowed rabbis to participate in activities with rabbis of other denominations on the condition that it was not related to faith. Maybe about like Zionism, politics, for example, but not something directly related to faith. So that was like a big, that was already at this point, it was like a big statement because all of the Orthodox movement completely refused to even acknowledge that those current streams existed, and when it did, there were them apicorsu, they were them like completely out of the right path of Torah. And later, another approach developed, which was to speak not only of the other currents, but of the non-observant Jews as a general thing, from the point of view of orthodoxy, that all of the people, the Jews, who did not practice as it should be, meaning the Orthodox way, were like children. We did not know and were not responsible, except for the leaders who were considered to be the real problem. But this approach is still not enough in the eyes of some Orthodox leaders, because it's very it's not really respectful to say that someone who has like a very big knowledge, to a very understanding of Judaism, but does nothing as you, is like a child because he was not born in the right path. So because all of those currents have, like all those streams have their own vision, and I think that we will benefit from discussing, exchanging, and reflecting together on philosophy, on the future of the Jewish people. And this is why today, on like my branch of like modern orthodoxy, another approach is being reflected on today by some of the leaders. It would be to like accept the existence of denominations and different ways of living Judaism by putting forward that all of these people seek to sanctify their life and God, and that we must therefore favor an approach that does not judge, and an approach that's more open. And this has rather great theological implications. And I hope that we will see the fruits of this openness in the future of the Orthodox world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emile. First of all, it was very interesting for us. We have one question. I would just like to ask you. It's from the chat. So, do you think there is actually an opportunity for communities to work together? And do you believe in this unique time of crisis, it's actually important that different denominations are able to come together for the Jewish community?
It's a very, very good question. Yeah, I think that today we have the opportunity of realizing that we are all Jews, all humans, and we are facing a crisis, and that we should all get together and be able to, to think and to talk about this crisis and to have maybe like a joint action. But I think I think the rabbis today have, from all different streams, have a responsibility to make sure that it's not only in times of crisis, but also in everyday normal life that we are able to speak together. That is not to say that we should, completely erase our differences. I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I'm a Reform one, I'm a conservative one, and I'm very firm in my in my Judaism, but I think that does not mean that we can't learn from each other, and I think that's what the Orthodox world today should realize, and also part of the Reform as well.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you very much again for doing this session with us from across the world. We hope you and your family are safe. If you want to follow other sessions or other lessons that Emile is doing, him and his wife Miriam have an amazing page where you can follow all their actions and activities. It's called Ayeka. You can find it on Facebook, Instagram, and all the other platforms. Thank you very much for having followed with us this amazing second episode. And we hope to see you soon for the next episode, which will be tomorrow with Joel Leskin about how to work positively and efficiently from home. See you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Bye.